Hello, this is Arlo Kilpatrick, the erudite Conophile, and today I'd like to talk to you about an issue that's at the heart of the moral arguments for and against bestiality: consent. Now, what is consent, first of all? We need to have some kind of definition if we're going to, talk about it and use it as some sort of standard for whether sexual activity is permissible or not. Well, the problem is there's a lot of equivocation going on about this term because when people use the word consent, they use it in two very different ways. One is what I would call rational consent. And what that is a sort of verbal, rational agreement between two people that they want to do a certain activity and that they have communicated to each other what exactly they want. And that's great for people. If two people are able to come to a rational decision about what they want to do, all the better for them. In fact, I doubt you would find many serious moralists who would claim that any activity to which two adults morally or rationally consent could possibly be wrong. I mean, if both parties agree to it, then who's being harmed by the act? There might be certain counterexamples you could bring up, but for the most part, if both people consent to it, then there's no problem in this rational way. We all agree on that. But there is another kind of consent which is used in sexual activity, and I'll call this behavioral consent, or perhaps I would use the term natural consent. And what that is it's not a verbal agreement, it's not a rational argument, it's not anything except some animal indicating through his or her behavior that they want this activity to go on, that they like the activity. So an example of this kind of consent would be when a dog wags its tail as you're petting it. It's wagging its tail, it's sort of smiling at you, it's nuzzling up against you. Through these behaviors, it is informing you that it likes the petting and wants the petting to continue. Now, do we say that petting the dog is wrong because they haven't come to a rational justification of why they want to be pet? Or because they haven't verbally agreed to be pet? No, we don't say that. We say that the dog wanted to be pet, and we've done no harm whatsoever to it. So really, this is good for both the dog and the human being petting them. I fail to see why the same argument couldn't be applied to certain sexual activities. After all, sex is a natural process. It is the way in which most animals reproduce. Well, maybe not most if you want to get technical about certain beetles and things. But because we as human beings have the sort of common behavioral cues of sexuality with these other animals, we should be able to tell pretty clearly whether they want to engage in sexual activity or not. I mean, how do you tell that human beings are into sex? Their tone of voice changes, they show certain physiological differences, their body temperature might rise, they might become lubricated in their sensual organs, and so on. Well, the same responses that we see in human beings are things we also see in other animals. And as a result, we can pretty safely apply the reasoning that if these same behaviors are showing up in the other animal, then the other animal is enjoying itself. Now, in the case of sexuality between two different people, informed consent trumps everything. I mean, if the woman is becoming sexually aroused by some man, but she still doesn't want to have sex for whatever reason and says no, then that is the thing that needs to be respected, because that is what legally counts as consent between two people. But between a person and another animal which can't consent in this fashion, there's very little justification for why we should expect morally a kind of consent which is impossible due to the other animal's lack of higher brain functions. I would say that any moral theory which depends upon an impossible thing to reject something is fundamentally flawed in some way. And I would say that because the animal doesn't have any sort of higher psychological problems that might arise later on from sexual activity, because the consequences are all localized, because, heck, even disease is not as much of a problem, although I'll get to that in a later video, because the only real consequences to the animal are, in many cases, pleasurable. In those cases, there's no real reason not to engage in sexual activity, other than perhaps you don't want to, and that's fine, but that's not a reason for two creatures of any kind to stop doing something. Now, you might argue that this higher functioning is also not present in mentally disabled people. And so as a result, if we're going to argue that bestiality is moral, if we're going to argue that bestiality is moral, then on the same argument, we would have to say that sex with permanently mentally disabled people would also be immoral. Would also be moral, rather. They stand on the same footing because in both cases, there's no higher brain functions, there's no psychological problems which arise as a result, and so we don't have to worry about that. But I think that in the case of people, there is more concern overall by other human beings about that person's welfare. Even if this mentally disabled, let's say, woman, if this mentally disabled woman wanted to have sex, but her caretakers didn't want her to do it because she might get pregnant, or she might have some baby, or I don't know. If she did do that, then there's not much that we can say other than that those other people object, and they need to work out with this other person who wants to have sex with the mentally disabled person what to do. But that doesn't negate all such activity. So I don't really know how to end this video, so I'll just say that if we're talking about two different forms of consent, if you're going to argue against bestiality, make sure you're consistent about what you're talking about. Are you talking about informed consent, rational consent, or are you talking about behavioral consent? And I would say this. If you think that all sexual activity requires rational consent, please explain to me why there are so many accidental pregnancies and why there are so many sexual activities which occur only with the behavioral type of consent, and why that is okay. And if it's not okay, then how are you going to prosecute the people who only use this behavioral consent? If you think behavioral consent is enough, well, congratulations. I think that that means you can support bestiality as a consistent position. Not all of it, obviously. There are situations where the animal won't consent, but there are plenty of situations where they will, and in those cases, there's no real reason to prohibit it, I think. I may talk about other reasons in the video later on, but for now, this is the Erudite Kind of File, signing out.